So our to-do list app is coming along nicely. However, there's still a couple of improvements we can make. First, right now we can't edit any of the to-do list items or even mark them as completed. Additionally, every time we add a new item to the list, the RecyclerView redraws the entire list. This is because we're calling notify dataset changed. We're going to fix that in this video. We'll begin by doing a couple of updates to our project, and we'll start by changing our Java version to 17. And be sure to set the JVM target to match. Next, we'll go ahead and open up Android Studio settings and go to Build Execution Deployment, Build Tools, and Gradle. And as our Gradle JDK, we'll select the JetBrains runtime version. And as always, don't forget to sync your project. Now we'll update our compile and target SDKs to version 34. And we'll upgrade our Android Gradle plugin by going to Tools, AGP Upgrade Assistant, and selecting version 8.1.1. And we'll click on Run Selected Steps. Now we can open our project's build.gradle file and bump up our Kotlin plugin version to 1.9.10. And if we go back to our apps build.gradle file, we can update all our remaining libraries to be on the latest version as well. And if you'd like, there's also the option of using Kotlin symbol processing for the room compiler. Now we're ready to add the navigation component dependency to our project. We're going to add this to our apps build.gradle file. And I'm going to copy the navigation version. And I'll just add another variable to our project's build.gradle file. Next, I'll copy the dependency for the fragment navigation component. And I'll add this to our apps build.gradle file under the dependencies section. We also want to use the SafeArgs Gradle plugin. So we're going to add this to our top level Gradle file. And to do that, we're going to need to add a build script block at the top of the file. We can paste our dependency declaration there. And we can also move all of our variables to the build script block while we're at it. Now we'll also need to declare the plugin in our list of plugins for the apps build.gradle file. I'm going to scroll up and add this right below the capped plugin. And now let's run the app, make sure it builds properly. And from there we can get started. Currently our app uses a linear layout manager to display the list of items. In order to make it easier to see the benefits of using DiffUtil, I'm going to change this to a grid layout manager within our Fragments XML layout. I'll also give it a span count of 2 to display our list in 2 columns. So now when I run the app, we can see the list of items displays in a 2-column grid. However, when I add a new to-do item, it gets added to the list, but there isn't a smooth animation. Instead, there's almost a subtle blink when the item gets added to the list. To fix this, we'll create a new class called ToDoItemCallback. And this will extend DiffUtil item callback. and we'll pass in our to-do class as its type. We'll implement its member functions. And this class will be in charge of comparing the differences between items in our list and deciding when they need to be updated. It does this by using two methods, our items the same, which will return true or false, and we'll set this to be whether the IDs of the two items match, and our contents the same, which will return true or false if the old item matches the new item. Great! That's all we need to do to create our DiffUtil item callback. Now we can modify our to-do item adapter to use it, and we'll start by making it extend ListAdapter instead of RecyclerView adapter. We need to tell ListAdapter which type of lists this adapter will receive, so we'll pass in our to-do class, and we'll also pass an instance of our to-do item callback to its constructor. Now, because we're using ListAdapter, we no longer need to declare a data variable or use getItemCount, since these are implemented as part of the default adapter behavior within the ListAdapter class. We can also replace this line with the ListAdapter's getItem method and pass it the same position value. We can also modify our to-dos fragment, and instead of having to assign the list of to-dos to a data variable, we can just call the ListAdapter's submitList method with the list of to-dos that we get from our view model. Sweet! Now we can run the app, and as we add a new item to the list, notice that there is now a smooth animation as the items in the list rearrange themselves in the RecyclerView. Let's add one more and take a closer look. Oh yeah, that looks much better. Now let's switch over to our to-do items XML layout and convert this to a DataBinding layout file. We're going to add a variable reference to our to-do class. And we'll use this to update the checkbox values with DataBinding. We'll set its text to be the to-do item's title, and its checked property to whether the item is completed. Now we'll want to modify our adapter's view holder to take the to-do item binding object as its parameter. We can get a reference to the root element using binding.root, and in our onBindViewHolder method, we can declare a reference to the card view using the binding object. And we can use this to update this call to set the card's background color. We can also update the view holder to use the binding object instead of calling findViewById, so we can remove this line. We can also modify the inflateFrom method so that the binding object inflates the views in our layout. And then return the view holder with the binding object. Now we can also simplify our bind method to bind each to-do item to our layout. Now we'll run the app one more time and just make sure everything's still working as expected. If you need a quick refresher on data binding, I've added a link to my data binding tutorial in the description. Now, in order to be able to edit our to-do items, we'll start by making them clickable. We'll do this by adding a click listener parameter to our adapter, and we'll set its type to be a lambda that takes in the to-do item's ID and returns a unit. We'll go down to our viewHolder's bind method, and we'll give it a click listener parameter as well. And we'll set a click listener on the binding object's root element with the value from our click listener argument. And here we can pass the item's ID to the click listener. We'll also update the call to the bind method in our onBind viewHolder to use the click listener. And we can also update the parameter to be as private. Now we'll update our to-dos view model to include logic for when the to-do item is clicked. First, we'll add a navigate to to-do live data with a mutable live data backing property. Then we'll add an onToDoItemClicked method, which will take the to-do ID and use it to set the value of the navigate to to-do property. Next, we'll add an onToDoItemNavigated method, and this we'll use to reset the value of navigate to to-do back to null. Now we can switch over to our fragment and modify our adapter instance to call the ViewModel's ToDoItemClicked method, passing in the to-do ID. Now we're going to create a new fragment for editing our to-do list items, and we'll call it Edit To-Do Fragment. And we'll start by editing its layout file. First, we'll switch this to be a linear layout, and we'll give it a vertical orientation and a horizontal margin of 10 dp. We'll also change this text view to be an edit text and give it an ID of to-do name. We'll set the height to wrap content, and I've already added some string resources which I'll pass to the autofill hints and the hint property. We'll set the input type to text, and we'll add some vertical padding of 20 dp and set the text size to 18 sp. We'll also add a checkbox widget, and we'll set its width and height to wrap content and give it an ID of to do done. We're going to add a layout gravity to start, a margin at the bottom of 20 dp, and set its text to say completed. We also want to add two buttons for updating and deleting our list items. We'll set their width to be 300 dp and height to wrap content. We'll set the layout gravity to center and the string of this first button to delete. And I'll also give it an ID of delete button. Now I'll go ahead and duplicate this button. And I'll change its ID to update button. And its text property also to update. And if we open our design view, we can see what our layout will look like for our edit to do fragment. Now let's create a ViewModel class for our edit to do fragment. And this will need two constructor parameters of to-do ID and the data access object for our database. This will extend the ViewModel class, and we'll get a reference to the to-do that was clicked using the DAO's get method and passing it the to-do ID. Now we'll add logic to navigating back to the to-dos list. So we'll need a navigate to list live data property with a mutable live data backing property. And we'll set this to be a Boolean type. We'll also want to create methods for updating and deleting. I'll start with an update to do method, and this will take the value of the to do and call the DAO's update method with it. However, since this is a suspend function, we'll need to call it within a coroutine scope. So we'll launch a ViewModel scope and move our function call inside it. Finally, we'll set the value of navigate to list to true. We'll add a delete to do item method, and also within a ViewModel scope, we'll set the to do items value using the DAO's delete method, and we'll also set navigate to list to true. And lastly, we'll add an onNavigated to list method, which will toggle the navigate to list back to false. Now, since our ViewModel has constructor parameters, we need to also create a ViewModel Factory. We'll give this factory class the same two parameters of the to-do ID and the DAO, and we'll also make it extend ViewModelProvider.Factory. We'll override the create method from the factory class and have it return model class get constructor, and we'll say long class.java and todo's DAO class.java. Now we just call new instance and pass the two parameter values from the constructor. From there, we can create a new navigation graph using the navigation framework. So we'll create a new resource file of type navigation. And using this design view, we can select and add our two fragments to create destinations in our graph. And by clicking and dragging arrows between the two fragments, we can add navigation actions. And lastly, with the edit to do fragment selected, we want to create a destination argument for the to do ID. And that's it for our navigation graph. Now that we're using the navigation framework, we'll need to edit our main activity layout to be a navigation host fragment. To do this, we'll add the app namespace. We'll change the ID to be navhost fragment container, the name to be navhost fragment, we'll set the navgraph property to the graph we just created. And we'll set it to be the default navigation host. We also want to convert our edit to do fragment to be a data binding layout and add a variable reference to its view model. Then we can get the values of the different properties from each to do item directly from the view model and bind them to each of the views in this layout. For the edit text, we can set its text to the to-do's title using our data binding syntax. The checkbox check property can be updated to whether the to-do is completed. And we can also trigger the update and delete methods in our view model using data binding with the two buttons. So we'll add an onClick, and using data binding syntax, we can call the methods directly from our view model. So here I'll call the update to do item, and I'll copy and paste this into the delete button and change it to be the delete to do item method. Now we need to update our edit to do fragment and remove all of the boilerplate code that gets generated when the fragment is created. Great! Now we can begin building our fragment. We'll create a reference to the data binding object with a backing property. And inside of our onCreate view, we can call fragment edit to do binding and inflate our layout. We'll get a reference to the root view and store it inside of a root variable. And just return it at the end of our onCreate view. We also want to get the ID of the selected to-do item from our FragmentArgs bundle. And we'll need a reference to the application. And we'll use it to get an instance of our database and a reference to the data access object. With that, we can create an instance of our ViewModel Factory and give it the DAO and the to-do ID. And now we can use the factory to create our view model. Check out the link in the description for a quick tutorial on view models and ViewModel Factory. Then we can link our view model instance to the view model variable in our binding object. And we set the lifecycle owner to view lifecycle owner. From there, we can observe the navigate to list property from the view model. And when it updates, we want to navigate back to our to-dos fragment. So we'll do an if statement, see if we should navigate, and we'll create an action using the to-do fragment directions. And then we'll call view, find nav controller, navigate to the action. We also want to call the view model's onNavigated to list method to reset the navigated to list property back to null. And finally, we want to call onDestroyView to set the binding object to null when the view is destroyed. Lastly, we also want to add a way to navigate to the Edit to Do fragment when we tap on each to-do item. For this, we'll observe the Navigate to To-Do property from the ViewModel within our To-Dos fragment, and when it changes, we'll create an action using the navigation component, and we'll pass it to the navigation controller. And finally, we'll call ViewModel onToDoItem navigated to toggle the value of navigate to to-do back to null. And now, as we run the app, we can tap on each to-do item, which takes us to the Edit to Do fragment, where we can change the text, and then tap the Update button to update the text and navigate back to the to-dos fragment. I can also mark an item as completed, and I can also select to-do items and click the Delete button to remove them from the list. Well, that's all for our to-do list app series. If you enjoyed building this app as much as I did, let me know in the comments below what you'd like to build next, and thank you for watching. Take care.